think perhaps Christian would be the best to reply to that.
I think it's something like a co-commentary. We had a question from that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was because I just identify with most of that diagram. Sorry, I don't know what that was. I don't know.
I probably agree with most of what you were saying, sort of your approach and the relationship between space, architecture, and relationships between people and built environment. But what you were, I kind of lost the link of how then you were translating your theoretical perspective actually into performing or generating designs in architecture. So I wondered, first of all, if you might have a comment about that. And secondly, when you scribbled your diagram on the wall there, were you just not explaining semiosis, sign processes, and Uexküll's Umwelt theory in a nutshell?
Yes, the first thing is very clear, that I said in the very beginnings, that attitude is important, and this scribbling thing is to explain why always there is such an attitude, also if you don't think so. So if all these nice and well-known architects speak about aesthetics and about form and about positions and don't know what, they are also have an attitude. Maybe this attitude is very much connected to that of the patrons. The patrons are maybe the government or people in a special social situation, and that yes, is the beginning for to think about a different, for example, my attitude and how can I fight with those architects if they always say this has nothing to do with ethics or with morality, or it's only the architectural reasons which we prove, and Alberti has taught us. And the second second part of your question was I forgot. Sorry.
Well, I was just saying that was what you were explaining was basically a process of sign relationships between objects, whether it's subjective or objective.
I think perhaps we should try and weave everything together. I think what was very interesting about the presentation is that it's a presentation in fragments, and one looks at these different fragments. And I would be much more curious about the relationships between them, rather than looking at the fragments in themselves, because they are only partial. At least that's how I would interpret this. And that I found really stimulating. So we get a case study, which is incredibly concrete, and then we get a bit of a story, and then we get a diagram. And now I think our role is to piece it all together. And that's where I think, I don't know, I would like to start. I think some of the early case studies were very kind of illustrative, but in a really nice way. They were really carefully chosen, this wall that somehow moves to whether accommodate the street or to exclude the street. I think is a very fine example of that. And then moving on to kind of definitions of what you called non-public space, which I think is very interesting to say it's actually non-public space. Well, because how do we name the space that is not public space, but yet it is not private space, which is actually a really interesting label to give to that. And then to move on to the flower, where perhaps it's not about the ordering of social relations through building, but somehow the ordering of social relations through flowers, which is a very beautiful, very ephemeral sort of example. I think the example or the case study that's perhaps most difficult to access if you're not familiar with the context from Berlin is the townhouses. Yeah, and in how far that is problematic. or I assume you were presenting it as a sort of problematic case study, or in how far that is also, let's say, in a city like London, common practice. So I think what would be interesting perhaps to see is in how far these different case studies start to look at different diagrams of how this ordering works. I think that's your proposition, I'm assuming. And so the first one would be a very simple kind of how building elements can do that. The next one would be how this is done through a kind of, as you call it, soft process. And the last one is through an urban process. So that's really interesting because it looks at different layers also, as different scales. What I didn't understand is this issue of relational space and the definition that was given of relational space. And I wonder if we can come back to that, because all of them are relational. So perhaps that's something that ties them together. And the move away from form and towards space, which Martina Löw makes. Could you perhaps explain a little bit more about how you define that relational space?
It's very simple. Relational means it is connected, and if we have, for example, we did last year in the field, if it is possible to take this term, in the field of art, a private collection which is also for a public ground given to a private person. So this person is in this field of art. His name is Bors, and he gets from the government. The government or the public gets a lot of spaces from the East Berlin situation 20 years ago. So they sold it to the most given people. So that was private people and not public interest things. So if this Bors makes his private collection in this whole thing, he takes a lot of place and a lot of possibilities of relations. That has to do with inclusion and exclusion. This art field is very important for Berlin, so it has nothing to do with social something.
So it's a non-relational space.
Yes. And another field which we researched in was what in Berlin is called, or in Germany is called the Tafel. That's places where people which has no work or are very poor can get food from supermarkets which are over the date or near at the deadline date for those. So and this is always around Berlin. So they are in a way exclosed. So this space is in the center of Berlin. Another place will be the castle, which will be reconstructed in the center of Berlin, and another place is those townhouses, which are in a way like this around the castle and like this. And now maybe you can understand how this is get a relation to all this, because that becomes walls which you cannot see, not in that simple way how it is in Padua and in Detroit, but on another way, because this place is non-public, not they exclude everyone which is not in this inner circle. And you talk about money in a way, because he, for example, makes he's in the advertising scene, so he makes this art thing and get from there Aufträge, commissions from a lot of industrial people who wants to be in this exclusive circle when he makes a party here, for example. So yes, that is a kind of relation. I don't know if it is really correct now. I did it now first time, but but if you see it like this, and yes, the relation is very clear. So what all these people here have in their conceptual orientation, and what these people, other arts people, galleries, museums, have in their conceptual orientations, makes makes a relation to the townhouses. You know, they want to go in those townhouses, and they have no chance to have here a public space like don't know, a children garden or something for people without money, which could be also possible because the ground is the owner of the ground is public at the moment.
Was public.
Was public. Is that a little bit understandable?
What you're talking about is that there are spaces, you're talking about the lack of integrated spaces, aren't you? So, there's a good example. My daughter was studying Belfast recently, and she was taken to all the places round the edges of Belfast where they were told they shouldn't go. And they were taken to all the estates around the edge of Belfast. And on Friday evening, they put walls across the roads. They still do this because people get drunk at the weekends, and then fights will break out. So they'll put walls across the roads between the Catholic and the Protestant areas. They still do this every weekend. So that it can be an integrated or so-called or sort of integrated community from Monday to Friday. But on Friday night, they split them off because they introduce alcohol, and that's considered to be a kind of catalyst for trouble, which is quite interesting in terms of a temporary kind of war.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Just say something. I think I'm here because one, two, three. The intention to analyze architecture as in its core function as an ordering of social relation, or in my terms, patterns of social interaction, is a very important premise, and I think every architect and designer works intuitively in this way and makes sure that that buildings operate in this ordering capacity, but there's no very little explicit discourse about it. Now, I think that the panel, in its totality, hasn't gotten very far in taking this premise forward. As far as I can see, it rests on that single phrase, and I didn't see any further clues so far. Now, particularly I want to take up Christian. I think that the immediately burdening this attempt to analyze architecture with an ethical or moral agenda is totally counterproductive, I would argue. And you have to decide whether you want to be an architect or when do you want to go into politics. And the way you talk, I mean, you're not an architect anyway, but let's say if an architects immediately go down this route, they're trying to substitute their kind of morality and politics for a kind of institutionalized political process. And I think that there's a kind of vanity and self-aggrandizement, and it's ultimately bound to fail. And for instance, if you talk about the various types of social spaces which are distributed in a city plan like Berlin, that's the ordering which takes place and which operates and has institutional backing. And it's not about kind of immediately the instinct is then to erase all distinctions and nuances and wanting everybody to be in every place. Then you deny ordering, I would argue. And I think, but there are some interesting points, I would say, how one could take that forward. Hints from some of what you've been saying. I would make the distinction between the ordering of social interaction through literally physical spacing, distancing, separation through physical walls. And of course, at the same time, we need to recognize that these spatial structures are then inhabited and moved through by sentient socialized beings, and that we use that sorting machine of the city and the spaces has always a subjective aspect of people sorting themselves into these spaces. But I think there's a next, so therefore I think what is important to bring next onto the table rather than this physical organization is reflecting perception, cognition, and a kind of semiological layer to this. And that's the kind of hints in this kind of, I think the examples are thought not be too pertinent. I didn't see all of them, but I think there should have been more everydayish rather than the kind of North Korea as an example. But I get the hint from there that that one has to get to analyze not only relations of proximity, distance, physical separation, but a kind of semiotic field which operates through distance, through association, through morphological affiliations, through identity construction, and so on. So that's an interesting aspect.
Completely right. If you're an architect like this, and we have a space which has to be built in a way, I tell you my need, and you make me models how this need can become possible. That's okay. But on the other hand, the examples we showed, my attitude would be to bring people in the city and people who live there, not only a few which have a lot of money, so that there maybe we are different, but that's okay. You know, we can discuss it and we can talk about it. And for sure, I'm not an architect, but I'm connected with this architecture, and it makes me unhappy to see what happens with those situations which I liked before. So I'm always in trouble with, and this trouble is always political, and that's in my opinion not correct and wrong, and very yes, something like boring. If the architect says, I'm an architect, I have nothing to do with politics. So that's Oh, I misunderstood? Yeah.
Well, slightly, because I think usually if we encounter clients which are legitimately constituting their interest, they're always already legitimate in the political process. So if we enter a competition for a new public space or cultural building, there's a legitimately constituted client. They've gone to a brief writing process, they've gone to budget allocations. They exist in the political process. And what I'm called for as an architect is to bring a kind of upgrade in my intelligence with respect to discourses you're hinting at, and understand the micropolitics of what is desired, required, was institutionally given to me, and I'm not substituting myself for that. And if you really want to do that, you're going to fail, I suspect. And you're going to, if the project is to kind of sabotage and critique that, then you're not in the domain, in the discipline of architecture. And I think if you feel that the urban planning processes and investment projects and also private clients, which together constitute as a field of public space and private space investment, that this is illegitimate. And then I think the decision can only be to go into politics. That would be my sense. I mean, you have to decide whether the contemporary landscape of the society existent is reasonable, legitimate, and that the projects which are launched through clients are worthwhile and legitimate projects. That would be my stance. I find it kind of that moralizing is definitely coming into quite quickly into conflict. I feel with what is really the task is to upgrade our disciplinary intelligence with respect to taking that headline of yours that we should think through architectural design as having the task to order social relations to bring it to the next level, rather than just their social internal discourses and their kind of the way they want to present themselves to a public. And in my terms, all architecture, all spatial arrangements are communications, but they're communications attributed to these institutions. So, and like this, the spaces which are arranged and offered and the whole ambience here in this building is attributed to the AA as an institution. Whoever has designed that, and the arrangements are in this space here, it's attributed to the host, to you guys. You are responsible to the kind of arrangement of this table with chairs in this way, and I see some intention to wanting to do something more encompassing and the setting of the light. But we are also coming in and we are kind of completing this premise, and some of us choose to pull it into the distance, not launch themselves to the front, but this is the kind of examples, I think, where we're constructing forms of interactions and see how the space matters within that. But I don't think it is helpful necessarily to burden this discourse from the very beginning with kind of negativity and rejection and an imposition of some kind of utopia which turns any project perhaps into kind of I don't know, gesture, sabotage, an artistic project rather than a design project. Design projects are for me projects which facilitate ongoing life and not project some other life, which is the life of your fantasy. And if this is which you can bring into a political arena or into an artistic arena.
Is it my luck that you're sitting the most distant from us? What do you think?
No, I was actually wondering, because you really put yourself to the front now, if we can have a little bit more of that, because Patrick's just launched his book recently, which has a chapter, and I haven't read it, about the organization of social environments. So I wonder in how far you want to enlighten us on what your stance would be in relation to exactly that thesis that Christian is putting forward.
Yes, I think that's what I mean. As I said, the premise is the same, in principle, and in my terms, I mean, and I'm making. I took the choice to be quite explicit in contextualizing this theory of architecture in an encompassing theory of society and social theory, which in this case is Luhmann's system theory. And that brings another question I had. When you, in your discourse, it is unclear what your key references are, and you seem to be vague. I think that's it's quite important to have a kind of consistent account, to not assume, again, as an architect, that you could rewrite social theory and substitute yourself, but it's a kind of, I think the best tactic and the only viable and credible tactic would be to survey a field like sociology and social science and theory of society, particularly in terms of where it could lead us understanding the contemporary conjuncture and tendencies. And that needs to be kind of surveyed, and then a decision needs to be made where to kind of hook one's project to. And I made this decision with respect to Luhmann's social system theory. I don't know, maybe you can let you come back at that point. Where's your, which kind of theory of society or sociology would be your starting point?
Our view is twice. One, we have a lot of architects in our group who are practicing architecture, and I have something like a general view, which is really meta-theoretical. So that to bring together is not so easy. You cannot discuss from the level of practice in the level of meta-theory. So we have a lot of language games, and who is allowed to say this is right and this is not right. We have only the possibility, I think, or I, not as an architect, have the possibility to describe society and to find there some reasons for something which is unrealized in my special attitudes and utopian views, and try to talk to communicate with architects. For it's sure there are different talents or intelligences, and one is very specialized in mathematics, and another one in aesthetics, and the third one in politics. But in fact, the fields of technique, the field of power, and the field of economic is not really ausgewogen, balanced. So if you describe society, you will see that economics will, and you see it at the moment in Japan, always are talking about what the price is for the energy in future, and this is the only view on a space situation. The same thing in North Africa. So you see, if you go on a higher level for to look what is the society, you get an idea that if the politics, the field of politics is not strange and hard and powerful enough, the architect, and that's really my opinion, has to take a little bit more of responsibility, which in earlier times maybe the politics did. And how you organize it, that's really a question of communication. There we are.
Well, I know this kind of, let's say, activist stance, forcing the politicization of one's project, where perhaps in terms of the reality of a project, when it's confronted, this politicization hasn't happened. I know there's always a potential that the political system picks up a project and starts criticizing it on the basis of its lack of appropriateness to a social context. But I would leave that to the political system. I find it artificial for the architect to kind of artificially push and politicize a project which isn't inherently political. And I would find that what you're suggesting, that the architect should take more responsibility, I would find that not plausible. It's perhaps an overburdening of the architect. Okay, I think the architect has...
That's it, so that's like two opinions. Yeah. So you are standing on the side that the architect is already ordered. So it's politically already ordered, and he's doing the same thing, making nice bread. And for sure you can't politicize bread if there is no lack of bread around, for sure. But we are not following that track any longer, that we are just taking architects being ordered by somebody else. So if we come back to the example of the townhouses, it's completely right that the design cannot solve any of these problems there. So to follow your discussion, I wouldn't believe that by a different design of 6.50 meter wide houses, you can solve any of the social relevant points. So you can just be aware as an architect and say, okay, I can't enter this kind of political discussion at that moment with that project, but I would like to be a functioning architect. Okay, that's fine. But you can't argue later that you were not part of this, of the construction of a homogeneous surrounding. That's all. But that's your decision. And for sure, it can mean not to take every commission you can get. For sure.
Absolutely. I mean, I would agree with that. The question is, how narrow do you define the slice of legitimate participation in a social process? And I would just be wary of an avant-garde, an academic discourse which narrows that slice to such an extent that there's virtually that every real world engagement would mean kind of dirty hands. And my perspective, I'm kind of proselytizing for a picture where there's many fantastic, exciting, wonderful projects to engage on in the real world, which have, where we can make a progressive, facilitating contribution, which could also stand up to some level of self-critique with respect to degrees, relative degrees of progressiveness in a field of possibility. In particular, in public competitions, you have the chance, to a certain extent, to question some aspects of a brief, maybe even fundamental. OMA are sometimes doing this. We are sometimes doing it to a certain extent. But, and you might or might not succeed. But I think what I sense here is a kind of too narrow a sense. It makes me wonder where are the legitimate projects, and also if I
Do you know, I don't know that well either, but do you know Arno's work? I mean, they're not on the fringes of some sabotage, subversive art projects. They do, you know, they're building. So it's not all about, or you wouldn't classify yourself as a sort of fringe
No,
saboteur.
I have only learned to be an architect, so I have no other skills. So I do it by architecture, for sure.
And you do it.
Yeah, I do it. I do build it. I do get money for it also.
So that's the kind of, they wouldn't.
But for sure, I'm not running a 50 people's office. That's maybe not possible for the moment. And all with this kind of.
There's this kind of slight, if I hear, let's say, well-known architect being kind of as an automatic assumption being kind of corrupted and serving kind of legitimate powers. I saw this kind of all too easy turn of argument. I find that highly problematic. To people who are, that means that you're assuming that society and its values and kind of selection processes which are operating are fundamentally corrupt, distorted, and leading to so those who succeed are automatically written off as well. This was Christian's kind of
No. We did not talk about corruption.
turn of argument, you famous architect.
I mean, but perhaps one should.
No, I mean that's what I sense here, but then maybe we should, if that's not the case, we should.
I mean, there might be a difference between the role of. I think that. So I just want to kind of throw one thing in very quickly. I think we need to make a distinction between the role of design and what design can actually do, and the role of architecture within these processes. And perhaps they're two different things. And I understand that. I think you're putting forward the role of design as something that is perhaps underestimated in the discussion today on the table. Although I feel perhaps this was more about the contribution of the disciplines. So perhaps we need to make clearer distinctions. But there were also a few other people that would like to say something.
Okay, I will try to, I don't know if I can make a bridge. And I will pick up the word attitude. And I think it's how is your attitude in terms of critique. If you're taking from a Kantian paradigm, you have to critique is something that is legitimate. Okay, and something that is legitimate has to be based in certain truths. okay? And I do understand, for example, that there is an activism that goes against this kind of legitimation, if you like. It has to be a critique of something that is there and makes it legitimate. But if we take a critique as another way of experiencing and feeling things, then we don't have to destroy the previous system in order to build our own. But all you have to do is actually we have to tweak the parameters of the system in order to push the system into certain kind of degree where actually at the age of chaos, as we say, and then to be conscious about what the system will be after this kind of transformation. And I think that links back to design, for example. I like to think what, because Patrick, you said about the design is about to facilitate the world. And in certain extent that's true, but that reminds me what Alan Kay said a couple of years ago, the founder of Xerox. He said, if you ask people what they want to facilitate for them, they say they want 10 times faster machines, 10 times harder, 10 times better. But the role of designer is to open new domains, and domains actually that are previously unexplored. And in that sense, it's not able then to actually say what is legitimate or is not, because the product is unleashed into the world, and what Stuart Kaufman would say, it is the adjustment possible. I mean, it goes into a process which actually explores the possibilities. And I think there's no problem with competitions and the star system, and well, maybe not call it star system, because by calling it as it is, you already make a category. But actually, you can make a critique, you can make an argument, and you can actually push the system of architecture, of design, into a certain excess when then it opens a new domain. And I think that's why I'm coming back to the main argument about the attitude. And I would agree with Patrick about the kind of the schematic of these sketches. To go from Kant to Luhmann and to Bourdieu, it actually, for me, confuses a lot of things. Because this kind of relation is based on the fact of the factuality, of a faculty of correlationism based from Kant, okay, that we actually form relations with elements around us. But the problematic with Kant, according to my reading, is that it presupposed the establishment of the subject. And that's completely different from the relationship that can be formed in a kind of a biosemiotic understanding, as a colleague just mentioned, or a kind of a Deleuzian pre-individual or Silber-Simondon pre-individual concept. So I think the subject, the construction of subject is kind of crucial in order to form the attitude, and from that to understand what design is and how design can actually be a catalyst in the process of the social formation. Well, it wasn't a question.
Maybe just one more point on this. I think we have very progressive clients, as far as I'm concerned, where I'm led, where the client can lead the politics. I don't have to bring in the category of justice. I just bring the category of interpreting and working together. For instance, with the BMW Central Building, or with Maxi as a museum institution, the intentions don't make these clients into bogus, power-hungry morons. These people, you will notice that they have progressive ambitions. They have to be, because they want to be productive. They want to be part of post-Fordist network society. So the agenda is not justice in these projects, but the agenda is intensification of relation, intensification of communication, the articulation of complexity, making legible and navigable of complex relationships within an organization and of the organization into its environment. So I think that's what I'm kind of, you find enough, I think, and exciting exciting projects. I think that's these kind of projects, which have this higher degree of complexity, multiple audiences, an intensification of relations and a simultaneity of orderings. That's, I think, makes it necessary to make this agenda again more conscious and explicit, and develop descriptive languages, both of the formal spatial arrangements and of the social communicative arrangements. And I'm looking for, in my kind of theories, to develop a kind of descriptive expertise and a vocabulary and a sort of concept to describe these, to then correlate these. And in a kind of older times, we could easily rely on, let's say, non-explicit, intuitive handling of these, and then concentrate of ways of making, concentrate of the more, let's say, what we traditionally understand to be the categories through which architecture thinks itself. And I'm kind of quite excited about, we have to go to fundamentals which were hidden and implicit to deliver the next stage, precisely for these kind of, let's say, what I call high performance projects in advanced high performance social environments. And I do agree, yes, that there is a lot of injustice in the world in many ways, but I don't think that an avant-garde architectural discourse can address these and take them on. What we could do is kind of seek out the progressive arenas of development of civilization and see what the requirements are there. For instance, we've been very keen to compete for Google Campus, which is a kind of high performance, high productivity, and socially super progressive ambience and social organism. And if we can succeed in
social ambience,
you go there, it's like you know, it's lovely. I mean, I've been, if you go to campus, I just recommend it. It's just, you feel like lifted out of into a social utopia. Everything is free. You can roam around. Everybody's super friendly. Everybody's super generous. I mean, that's premised on the super productivity, and they kind of correlate. And the kind of spaces they're looking for are the discourse they're looking for is the kind of discourse I can offer. And I think, well, and you wouldn't go there and start, you know, criticizing the justice of or the right of Google to exist. You just thrive, and you want to be the architect who makes them thrive more.
I'm slightly reminded by what you were saying by sort of kind of early feminism, when you kind of, women had to point out that you know, streets were dark and that wasn't very nice, and there are not enough toilets in the theatre and all this sort of thing, and the corridors up, you know, tower blocks aren't, you know, feel dangerous. So it's just a sort of, a lot of it. It is a perceptual, you know, or it's a conscious. Yeah, you can change your viewpoint, yes.
Also, I think to everyone, when we're talking about brief writing, when does a point of brief writing happen? So you're saying the brief has always been written and then the townhouses get designed. But aren't we saying that we as architects are very well positioned to actually be part of the brief writing process, like for the BMW project? The BMW managers wouldn't have known what is possible, what could be made in all these amazing environments. And the investors for the townhouse, you know, so if we as architects, we need to thrive to become more involved in the brief writing, and that's the actual, the most architectural sort of action we can do, I suppose.
Just to give you an example with the townhouses, so like criticizing the 6.50 meter wide making of lots, and to tell the city government that that is like driving to homogeneous neighborhoods. Now we have elections in the end of the year, so now 3 or 4 parties came to us to ask us, how should we change it? Is it better to have like 12 meters? How shall we make it? We don't know it. So then the design, what you are talking about, is changing completely. It's not, I will never become a politician. But now we have to think about, okay, how should they split up the lots? And should they really sell them? Or should they like find different systems of lending in like 60 years? What does it mean? And we also have like close to the main station, we have some quite really expensive grounds. And now the same political part of the city government is coming to us and asking us, how can we create the contracts towards the financial side to get like a different system of what we can gain out of our properties as a city. So, and that makes completely sense to us. So not to be in this, let's say, last phase of design, but to enter much earlier into the design process. And what we recognized in this townhouse discussion, that if any architect enters into the 6 meter 50s discussion, he cannot come out of that. So there's really the very last end of the row of a design process. So let's move into a little bit earlier. But as we are not asked by a political system, voluntary, we somehow have to put some pressure on it, also with critique, which is a very nice instrument, and other ones, just to let us come in earlier. And I think we are all quite sure that if we could enter the design process much earlier, we would all gain out of that. No?
That's quite negative. Sorry, I have some point, but it's not meant to be.
Yeah, no, we have to. I think.
Thanks for giving me some voice.
No, I was also going to say thank you also for your comments, because I think what seems really relevant is to actually establish a discourse about exactly these topics, because there is currently a lack of discourse, and this is what this event was also about. And I would like to thank you very much for coming over tonight and sharing your views. And I think it was a very interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you.